what you do, you always get around 1 degree centigrade, a little more in Fahrenheit. So that's often called the climate sensitivity, how much the Earth warms if CO2 doubles. You often have to wait 10 or 20 or maybe even 50 years because the ocean absorbs some heat. But so they call it the equilibrium sensitivity, meaning you wait long enough for transients to die down. So 1 degree is not enough to worry anyone. It's probably good for the Earth. I would like to have a little longer growing season. All my backyard garden has been killed by frost, and I would have gotten a better crop this year. We'd have had a few more growing days. In order to alarm people, in the cynical view, they have said, well, that's only the direct effect of CO2. There are feedbacks, and there are feedbacks that amplify this warming. So they're positive feedbacks, and that's a little strange already because most feedbacks in nature are negative. Positive feedbacks occasionally occur, but they're very unusual. For example, in thermodynamics, one of the first things they teach you is something called Le Chatelier's principle, which says that, if you change some system, the system will try to figure out how to cancel the change, not to make it bigger. So they somehow convinced themselves that you could amplify these direct effects of CO2, and the mechanism that was suggested was that the main greenhouse gas is not CO2 at all, it's water vapor. So if you can somehow have a little bit of CO2 make the effects of water vapor, the warming effects, much bigger, then that would be enough to alarm people and, keep your research funding coming in indefinitely. So that's what they did. And now the years have passed. Those first suggestions were by one of my colleagues here at Princeton many, many years ago. And there's been time enough to see whether it works. It doesn't seem to work. It looks like if there's any feedback at all, it is just as likely to be slightly negative. And in other words, the warming may be even less than the 1 degree direct warming that people had expected. And so that's the situation. The warming has been disappointingly small from the point of view of the alarmists. And it's not even clear how much of the warming we've seen there that is actually from CO2. There are natural fluctuations of temperature that could easily have caused it, half of it, or maybe all of it.
Well, this is the remarkable thing, is that given that we've had enough time as a species to evolve from single-celled organisms, there must have been dampeners on the complexities of the system so that there wouldn't be this runaway. I mean, if we were going to turn into Venus, it would have happened, billions of years ago. And so there must be mechanisms by which any sort of big spike or change in the system is self-correcting. And of course, one of the big ones is that if you get more CO2, you get more plants. And when you get more plants, they take out more CO2. And so these kinds of things, it's kind of a common sense thing. And given that CO2 was far higher in the past than it is now, if runaway CO2 was going to happen, it would have happened long before we had the chance to evolve the capacity to come up with a global warming theory.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of the geological evidence indicates that CO2 is a minor player. I mean, we've had ice ages with 10 times more CO2 than we have today. That's not supposed to happen according to current computer models, but it did happen. And so people agree with you. There must be some kind of negative feedback that tends to keep the Earth's temperature about the same. There are many suggestions. One of the more attractive ones is by Professor Dick Lindzen at MIT. He calls it the iris effect. But it's related to the fact that clouds and water vapor are the big players in global warming. And clouds are interesting. Low clouds tend to cool the Earth. You know that if you go out on a summer day and a cloud comes by, the sun doesn't beat down as hotly and you feel a little better in the shade. But high clouds, cirrus clouds, which you can just barely see, high above us, tend to warm the Earth because they let the sunlight through so we get hot, but they trap the infrared. So Professor Lindzen's argument is that because of the details of the way cirrus clouds are produced, many of them near the equator in the tropics, you will get actually less cirrus clouds if things get a little bit warmer. And so that will tend to cancel the warming and keep the temperature stable. So he called it the iris effect. I think it's promising. It may be right. It may be wrong. But anyway, all of the evidence is there's some kind of negative feedback mechanism that's working.
Now, you've also mentioned that there's a huge boon to agriculture. And of course, most people who know the crazy argument that CO2 is some kind of a pollutant rather than what we're all made of. It makes all of us pollutants. But you've pointed out that CO2 has a significant benefit to agriculture just in terms of making plants more drought resistant. I wonder if you could help people sort of follow that reasoning, because I hadn't heard of it before you had mentioned it.
Well, yes, when I was in grade school, my teacher told me, well, CO2 is good because plants use CO2 to make sugar, with the aid of sunlight. They need some water too. And so I was surprised as I grew up to discover CO2 is called a pollutant, especially since each of us, with every breath we exhale, we exhale, 40,000 parts per million CO2, which is 100 times more than is in the atmosphere now. So you have to scratch your head and think, why is it a pollutant if I'm exhaling this stuff? And indeed, plants are really happy to have more CO2. They're in a kind of a CO2 famine now with respect to geological history. If you look over the last 600 million years or so, 550, so-called Phanerozoic, when there's been a good fossil record that you can use, CO2 levels have typically been 4 or 5 times higher than they are now, measured in thousands of parts per million, not hundreds of parts per million. And plants loved it. The earth flourished, life flourished on the land, in the sea. There was no danger from ocean acidification, all of the other scare stories you read about. They just didn't happen, nor should they happen if you do the science correctly. So the reason that happens, there are 2 key reasons that plants like more CO2. One reason is that when photosynthesis evolved, maybe 4 billion years ago, it was a long time ago from the geological evidence, there was almost no oxygen in the air. And so the key enzyme that the plant uses to make sugar and other products of photosynthesis is called rubisco. And this enzyme is the most abundant protein in the world. We all hear about protein, but the most abundant is the one that fixes carbon. And this evolved so long ago at the time of practically no CO2 that it turns out it's poisoned by oxygen. So we think of oxygen as something that's good for us, but if you read the health literature, actually, living things have a problem with oxygen. It oxidizes very well, including your DNA and other things. So we're full of antioxidants that help us to live and to cope with the oxygen atmosphere that we live in now. And plants have the same problem, but in spades, because their basic enzyme, rubisco, is poisoned by oxygen. So at low levels now, when there's not enough CO2 in the air and the plant is desperate to find a CO2 molecule, it's been primed by sunlight, it wants to do something. If it can't find a CO2, it finds an oxygen molecule, and there's plenty of oxygen. And instead of making sugar, it makes nasty things like hydrogen peroxide, which chew up the insides of the plant. And so the plant has to have all sorts of biological machinery to detoxify the products of, this is called photorespiration, and it's not good for the plant. So the more CO2 there is in the air, the less oxygen is needed, and so the less this photorespiration damages the metabolism of the plant. So that's one reason. Now, there's a second reason, and that is that the plant, for every CO2 molecule that diffuses into the little holes in the plant, the little stomata they call them, little mouths, roughly 100 water molecules diffuse out. So the plant, it has this dilemma that it has to have CO2 to eat, so it has to have holes in its leaf, but the holes allow the leaf to dry out. So if you have more CO2, if you double the amount of CO2, the plant only leaves half as many holes, and so it's not so leaky for water vapor, and so it can live with less water vapor. So now if you look at satellite images of the Earth, the Earth is greening, but where it's greening most is in arid regions near the edges of the Sahara Desert, Western Australia, Western United States. And that's because plants that were struggling to cope with low rainfall now have enough rainfall. Rainfall hasn't changed, but there's more CO2, so they don't need as much water. So there are these two basic things that make CO2 good for green plants. One is it suppresses photorespiration, this toxicity of oxygen. And two, it means the plant doesn't need as much water vapor. I shouldn't say water vapor, doesn't need as much water.
Well, and of course, it costs a huge amount of energy to get water and desalinate it if it's salty and get it out to plants and so on. So the fact that it's kind of hanging out in the air, or at least that the plant needs less water vapor or less water as a whole, is beneficial for the environment because you don't have to spend all this energy getting this water out to where the plant is if you're a farmer.
Right, that's right. And that's why the edges of deserts are getting greener.
Now, the theory, of course, to do with global warming has to do with if you double CO2, of course, you're going to get an increase. And then if you add more sort of in a sort of step-by-step, an extra 400, 400, 400, it's going to get crazy. It's going to go off the rails and it's going to go up in this crazy way. But the reality seems to be that, okay, you double from 400 to 800, you get a degree of warming. But if you add another 400, you don't get a degree. You have to go to 800, then to 1600. So it's got this logarithmic dependence that would cause a diminishment of the effects of CO2 over time, even if you add the same amount